Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified. I'm your host, Mark the Liberty, and joining me today is...
Corey Tasteless Joke Not Grinder.
I don't want to know what your tasteless joke is, actually.
I might find out.
Moving on. On today's episode, we will discuss the recent zero-day actively exploited vulnerabilities in VMware's ESXi, Workstation, and Fusion products. After that, we'll talk about a recent action report from a Akira ransomware attack against an unknown unknown It was still
good anime
bad
attacker group.
Yeah. And then we will end with a blog post from Microsoft's Threat Intelligence Center on the latest techniques being deployed by Silk Typhoon. With that, let's go ahead and, let's just go ahead and start.
Yeah, with the world, I guess we've given up on creativity.
So let's start this week, Corey, with what I think are actually some pretty dang serious vulnerabilities that I wouldn't say they flew under the radar, but they didn't exactly light up on at least my news feeds. But long story short, if you're using VMware ESXi, Workstation, or VMware Fusion, you should probably take some time and install VMware's patches they released last week as soon as possible. Last week, they disclosed and published fixes for 3 vulnerabilities, and CISA, or at least the 2 people that are probably still working at CISA, quickly placed this on their known exploited vulnerabilities list very soon after they were patched. So of the 3 vulnerabilities, the most serious one is CVE 2025-22224, which is a critical severity vulnerability in ESXi and VMware Workstation that could allow an attacker to execute arbitrary code on the hypervisor level. So this meaning an attacker with a privileged access, they do have to be an admin on the guest, so on the virtual machine itself, could exploit this vulnerability to escape the virtual machine and execute code on the hypervisor, which this is the holy grail of vulnerabilities when it comes to virtual machine issues. There were 2 other ones, 2025 quadruple-25, which is a high severity vulnerability in ESXi that allows the attacker to execute arbitrary code in the host's kernel memory. This one I think seems a little more difficult to exploit, which is why despite the elevated level of execution access and kernel space, it is a lower severity finding. And then quadruple-26 is a high severity finding in every flavor of VMware, ESXi, Workstation, and Fusion for macOS that allows attackers to at least leak information from the host system, so the hypervisor level. So all of these are under active exploitation. It sounds like Microsoft's Threat Intelligence Center are the ones that actually found these vulnerabilities under exploit and reported them to VMware. They haven't published any info yet, but Microsoft's usually pretty transparent a few days or weeks after the fact with a report about these types of vulnerabilities. But I saw a post from, it was a picture of a tweet because I still refuse to go on the platform formerly known as X. But I guess a group called the Shadow Server Foundation published a tweet saying they found 37,000 internet exposed ESXi servers that were vulnerable to that first issue. Now, this is different than previous VMware vulnerabilities where the server being exposed to the internet is what attackers are going after. Historically, the ones we've talked about are authentication bypass vulnerabilities, or code execution vulnerabilities through the management interface. These ones are different. Just being exposed to the internet doesn't make you vulnerable. You have to have access to the virtual machine running on the hypervisor.
This would be more like if a company was using virtual remote desktop in some sort of guest fashion. There's a bunch of companies that offer you to have access. I mean, for malware research, for instance, you might get access to someone else, a organization's virtual remote desktop to play with a Windows machine virtualized. And essentially, if you have it is unusual if you're using a guest virtual desktop to have admin on the guest machine. But if you do, you can get that first one right. And
I'm
I guess
picturing
other situations, if there were credential stealing, if you used virtual desktop interfaces for your company and someone logged into a virtual desktop, they might be able to leverage this with local system admin.
I'm comfortable talking about it now since we patched it internally. But for example, our malware analysts use a series of networks and air gap machines to do their work of analyzing malware, to classify it, or to find new IOCs that we can feed back into our endpoint tools. And so there's a theoretical scenario where, like our red machines, where they're doing this actual analytic work, where maybe as part of their analysis, they want to run the malware as an administrator to watch its activities. And if it was a payload that had this exploit in it, it could effectively escape that, what should have been sandboxed machine, and compromise the entire hypervisor, which is pretty dang scary. So yeah, I think, I mean, at a minimum, if you are using ESXi, especially if you're using virtual machines to run untrusted applications and any sort of analysis, this should be a priority vulnerability or series of vulnerabilities for you to fix. But I mean, silver lining, at least just having your hypervisor exposed to the internet isn't enough to exploit it like the previous ones. That said, 37,000 hypervisors exposed to the internet is pretty nuts all in itself. You're just hoping that VMware doesn't have another auth bypass vulnerability, which they seem to have been hemorrhaging over the last couple of years. Put it behind a VPN, seriously. But so when it came to the last tidbit for this, the Shadow Servers Foundations, like of those machines that were exposed, they found the overwhelming majority of them were actually in China. Something like 4,500 were in China.
I think you mean China.
Yes, exactly.
We're under new administration. You got to say it right, Mark. China.
4.3 thousand were in France, and 3.8 thousand were in the United States. And then the rest were a bit small fries after those. So the bulk of exposed systems, China, France, and the US. Either way, patch your systems and move on. The second thing I wanted to talk about was a pretty interesting war story or after action report from researchers at SRM. They published a blog post last week describing a Akira ransomware incident that they recently responded to that leveraged IoT devices to encrypt network-connected systems. So this attack started with Akira compromising the victim's network through externally facing remote access solutions. So I think, like you were just mentioning in the last discussion, Corey, like remote access tool or potentially a VPN appliance as the bastion that let the threat actors in. Once they had access to the network, they deployed AnyDesk, which is a quote-unquote legitimate remote access or remote management application for Windows machines that attackers are commonly using to set up a difficult to detect remote access to these systems. Basically, because it's not malware.exe, like your typical antivirus won't detect it, only your EDR tools that are designed to catch this type of activity.
We have seen it's a legitimate tool. We see people use it, but by the way, our policy is not to allow this particular RDP. So you really should use the EDP tool that can detect these legitimate programs so that you can have policy to not allow certain ones that you don't want.
Yep. Once the attackers gained remote access through AnyDesk, they did a network scan to try and find different network connected systems and the services that were exposed. They then moved laterally using RDP to a server on the network, and they tried to deploy the ransomware using a password-protected zip archive, but the EDR tool on that server actually caught it, and it instantly quarantined that zip archive. So the tool was working, but the attackers didn't give up in this case. So instead of trying again or potentially raising more red flags, they took a look at their network scan and found a network-connected camera that was hanging out there. And it was a pretty good target for a few reasons. So it had critical vulnerabilities, including remote shell capabilities. It was running a Linux-based operating system, which their ransomware payload was compatible with. And it obviously did not have EDR installed on it. Like
one of the issues with IoT.
Yeah. Exactly. Even if they're running a stripped down version of Linux, you don't typically see endpoint protection tools deployed to them.
You mostly can't. I mean, it's not like they give you installers, even if they are Linux, for any tools.
Or it's not like they
Most
even have
IoT
enough
devices.
storage or memory to run any of
Yeah.
these applications too. But they were able to exploit a vulnerability and take over that camera. And then from there, they started mounting network shares using SMB and encrypting them directly from that camera. So, like a couple takeaways from here. The first is, I think if you're running a modern SOC and you have access to telemetry, like first and foremost, you should have a good baseline of what's normal on your network. And normal on your network should not include webcams connecting to your Windows servers over SMB, which means like if you start seeing a webcam suddenly mounting network shares, that should be a major red flag, like an immediate red flag that something's been compromised.
But you kind of need NDR or SIM products to do that. So
Yeah,
just shout out for things like WatchGuard's Threat Sync plus NDR for having at least capability to pay attention to lateral movement on networks.
exactly. The second kind of takeaway from this that I had was I don't know, they didn't tell us the timeline between like the initial compromise, the attempt to deploy ransomware to that server, and when they finally blew everything up with the camera. But I have to imagine like it wasn't immediate. There was probably a decent amount of minutes, hours, or even days between attempting to deploy ransomware on the server and the webcam itself finally encrypting everything. But like if you get an alert on your EDR tool that it blocked and quarantined a ransomware file within a password protected zip archive on one of your servers, that means you go into incident response mode and you start figuring out what the heck's going on. And clearly that didn't occur in this case. And the attackers had enough time to pivot to that webcam and execute their objective finally.
I would have to say, like, we have the people listening to this podcast are probably mid-market or a lot of SMB, small business owners, and or the MSPs that provide services for them. If you're an MSP, you already have this capability, but I think a lot of the small service providers probably don't have a SOC team that monitors in the way we do, Mark, and has a incident handling mode. They probably don't have incident handlers. So just a shout out of this is why we're starting to provide services for partners, and that your partners, MSPs out there, provide services like MDR, managed detection and response. And often that's endpoint managed detection and response, which you sometimes do need incident response handlers to look at suspicious things and find it. But in the future, you can definitely add things like network incident response to things like our MDR, XDR services. So long story short, if you're a small company that does not have incident handlers or a SOC, this is kind of why companies need it. There's a class of attacks that if it's not detected immediately, it will start lateral moving. And that's where there's lots of tools to detect them, but they're not like immediately automatic. You need people to watch them. And I recommend just going to if you're too small to have incident response service, that's what MSPs and MSSPs can provide you, for a price that SMBs can actually pay for. Not only will they manage your endpoints for you, but they will secure and monitor them as well as your network too. So just a shout out, if you're too small to have incident response, be sure to, consider MSPs.
It's a really good point. And like just reiterating that, I feel like for smaller organizations or even like smaller MSPs, they would see a blocked malware event from their EDR tool and they would say, oh, look, it's doing its job. And then they would move on. When the reality is like a blocked malware event still requires investigation. It could have been something as simple as like a user getting tricked into downloading something. And so yes, it being blocked means that you're good to go. Or it could mean that an attacker has gained a foothold on your network and deployed AnyDesk to maintain that remote access. And now they are attempting to deploy ransomware without anyone knowing. Like a blocked event doesn't mean that the job is done. It means that you have to go and investigate. And like you said, if you don't have the resources for that, that is where a managed service comes in to help out. But either way, the this is also why you don't put your IoT devices on your same network as the rest of your important systems. And at a minimum, I don't see any reason
Why
to
not? I
allow
think you just
SMB
should put them
network
all in the
access.
same place. Make sure your Active Directory and your webcam are right in the same place. Give them the same password and make it something easy like dead so that you can get into it quickly when people are hacking it. Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Yep, exactly.
Hopefully people
Or
no sarcasm.
segment it and don't allow SMB access from it to the rest of your servers, because that's just asking for trouble.
That's the real advice there.
Moving on, the last story. So Microsoft's Threat Intelligence Center, speaking of them, just published a blog post last week with some pretty interesting analysis of tactics from Silk Typhoon, which is a Chinese nation-state espionage group. Microsoft describes Silk Typhoon as a well-rounded and technically efficient threat actor that can quickly operationalize exploits for zero-day vulnerabilities in edge devices. They noted their targets are worldwide, not just in the US, and they focus on a bunch of different verticals, including IT services, managed service providers, and then traditional verticals like healthcare, legal, education, government, and NGOs. But their blog post picks up in late 2024 when they found Silk Typhoon was using stolen API keys and credentials from privileged access management tools or cloud app providers or cloud management capabilities to start going after organizations and their downstream organizations. So imagine go after an MSP, but your real target is the customers that MSP manages. So they start by trying to gain access to the service provider's environment, typically using password spraying or leaked corporate credentials from public repositories.
By the way, pause there. I don't know if we have any proof of this, but our podcast for the last year and a half, did it start even in 2023, Mark? But we've seen huge password spraying attacks. And spraying is kind of like a crappy brute force attack in that it's credential stuffing is at least working off known passwords associated with a known email address, whereas password spraying is just essentially brute force, trying whatever their actual passwords that have leaked, but it's just trying them with every account. But anyways, we've seen a lot of those attacks, and they've even been noisy enough to even down services sometimes. So I just thought it was interesting. We don't really know where those attacks are coming from, but it's interesting that this state-sponsored actor is using password spraying.
Yep. Once they gain access to an environment, they look for API keys or service principals attached to cloud applications. And then they start abusing those to do things like access downstream customer tenants, to use read access to recon and collect data from devices. They'll reset default admin accounts using that API key, deploy web shells, or even create additional users and then clear logs to clean up after themselves. Once they gained initial access through those password spray attacks, they sometimes leveraged, but the other thing is they mentioned they go after leaked credentials and public repos too, which is interesting. So GitHub. If you are working on a cloud application, you've got a corporate GitHub account, and you accidentally make a commit with your API key still in it, attackers are always on the lookout for those and can very quickly steal them and operationalize them. They found in January of 2025, they also exploited zero-day vulnerabilities in Avanti's Pulse Connect VPN in order to gain initial access into the networks. Once they're in a network, they're also targeting Azure AD Connect, which is also called Entra Connect. It's the service that you use in a hybrid Azure AD environment to sync either your on-prem AD to cloud or your cloud back down to on-prem. Microsoft noted that if they gain access to that server where this Azure AD Connect is running, they could potentially escalate their privileges or access both on-prem and cloud environments. They said that they're abusing OAuth applications that have privileged access to steal email or OneDrive or SharePoint data using the Graph API from Microsoft. They also compromised multi-tenant applications, which potentially allow them access to other tenants. So multi-tenant applications, a service provider might host one to grant themselves access to their customer environments. If the attacker can add credentials to that multi-tenant application, they now get all of the permissions granted to it and all of the client tenants that have granted that consent. They've even tried creating their own Entra ID applications to steal data. They usually name them ways to hide in the environment. So name them unassuming things. Makes sense. I don't think an attacker would create an application that says, "Look at me, I'm Silk Typhoon."
You're screwed. Don't
Exactly.
open this file or ignore this account.
When it
I'm
came
the
to
bad
their
guy.
Yep. When it came to their communications, they used a covert channel that primarily consisted of CyberRoam appliances and Zyxel
By the way,
routers.
CyberRoam doesn't exist anymore. CyberRoam is Sophos. So this is old Sophos appliances. Sophos bought CyberRoam and Astaro in order to have firewalls. So just saying.
So
Zyxel
ultra
routers.
old.
Yeah.
How old? When was the last one of
That
those
was
end of life?
CyberRoam was purchased by Sophos years and years ago, like an insane amount of time. And it was a really weird. I know it because they bought two firewall vendors that had similar capabilities, and it took them a long time to create one OS for both of them. But
Trying to
they were acquired
find.
a long
They
time
don't
ago.
list a date for when this was, but I imagine this was an extremely long time ago. That
It was.
there's a couple that didn't reach end of life until 2023. So there's a few that might have survived a bit, but it looks like the rest of them are Cisco or Sophos acquired them in 2014. So it's been quite some time, like you said. Either way, old appliances exposed on the internet make great proxy points for attackers to hide their communications.
And Zyxel, a lot of people try to buy Zyxel firewalls and routers because they're like very inexpensive. There's a reason I don't consider them real firewalls. So to me, they're like a consumer router. So not that fancy routers don't have flaws too, but old consumer stuff sitting on the internet, end of service, end of life, probably dangerous.
Yep. In the past, they've also targeted Palo Alto, Global Protect gateways, and Citrix NetScaler gateways, as well as in 2021, Microsoft Exchange servers themselves through the proxy logon vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
So when it came to the guidance Microsoft gave, like it should be kind of obvious. Make sure that any public-facing devices are patched. Specifically, if you've got a Avanti Pulse Connect VPN, make sure it's updated. Make sure you've got strong controls and monitoring for applications and service principals. So your application registrations and your Entra tenant, make sure that you are aware of what permissions they have, what credentials are on them, and you're monitoring for risky things like new credentials or service principals being added. Make sure you monitor service principal sign-ins for unusual locations. Like generally, these will be used by like an application integration, and so they should usually be associated with like a single IP or like at least a single application logging in. If you suddenly see a service principal being used to log in from China, that should be a red flag. And then just
Still
adopt
good. Right. China. Sorry. Keep going.
Never. And then make sure that you adopt good credential hygiene. So specifically take actions to reduce credential exposure. Like don't check your API keys into source code. Don't even put them in source code in the first place so you don't accidentally do it too.
By the way, I think I should, sorry to pause you. Your stuff is way more important, but to any Chinese listeners and friends we have, I actually think we should pronounce it properly. I'm making a self-deprecating joke at my country, not at China itself. Just so you know.
I wonder how many listeners in China we have that aren't like nation state threat actors getting really ticked off at us.
That's a good point. I do love the Chinese citizens, though. Great country. We have offices there. Love it.
I think like one of the takeaways for our audience are like if you're a service provider and you're using application registrations to access your customers' Entra tenants, make sure you're paying attention to who or what are logging in with those app registrations and what level of permissions they have.
They also forgot, by the way, being that some of the covert networks are these hacked devices. Don't expose management interfaces, put MFA on everything you can. I think the Connect Plus, the Ivanti flaw, was a flaw that happened pre-authentication, so it may not always help, but use MFA. But yeah, good article.
And MFA would help with the password spraying too. Like,
absolutely,
that alone would stop a lot of the initial access that the threat actors were using. But whatever, job security for us, right?
I don't know if I want it that way. It's getting too hectic in our field.
Definitely feels like things are heating up a little bit.
It's not as fun when our country seems to be maybe defunding all the protections that we have in place for this stuff. I guess they might have reversed that, but for a while they're like, oh, don't worry about Russian nation state actors. They're fine. No, thank you.
And whoever is still employed at CISA, thank you for your work.
Yes. We believe in keeping you. So we don't believe in defunding CISA.
No, definitely not. Oh, well, hopefully next week we get some good news. Like, we've solved all of our cyber problems and you and I can go retire somewhere.
Yeah, because that happens every week. Can't wait.
Can't wait. Or maybe just AI will replace us and I can go retire anyway. Hey everyone, thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you have any questions on today's topics or suggestions for future episode topics, you can reach out to us on Blue Sky. I'm at itsmark.me. Corey's at secondep.bluesky.whatever. And we're also both at Instagram at watchguard_technologies if you want to send us your recipes or whatever else you do on Instagram. Thanks again for listening, and you will hear from us next week.
Go Arsenal.